There's something strange happening with a lot of single men right now. The same guy who will grind 80-hour weeks to build a business, who will run through pain just to finish a race, who will sit through years of rejection to build the career he actually wants. That same man, when it comes to relationships, suddenly hits the brakes. He won't chase. He won't overextend. He won't give everything the way men were once told to give everything. Watch the ambitious professional who used to plan his whole future around a wife and kids, now treating commitment like a legal risk. Watch the divorced man rebuilding his life from zero, allergic to anything that resembles the deal he just walked away from. Watch the younger guy who hasn't even been married yet, but who has watched enough older men lose everything that he's quietly decided not to play that game at all. The easy explanation is that men got selfish, that men got lazy, that dating apps broke something in them, or that they're simply scared of commitment. That explanation falls apart the moment you look closer. Because these are not lazy men. These are men who sacrifice constantly, just not here. So the real question isn't whether men still know how to sacrifice. It's why they're refusing to do it for women anymore. And the answer isn't bitterness, it's math. To understand what changed, you have to understand what the old deal actually looked like. For generations, sacrifice inside a relationship wasn't just expected of men. It was the whole architecture of what made a man respectable. You worked hard, you provided, you protected, and in exchange, you got a home, a family, a role in your community, a kind of status that didn't really exist any other way. It wasn't romantic idealism that pushed men into that arrangement. It was incentive. Sacrifice was attached to something that felt solid. Marriage was perceived as far more permanent. Providing meant something specific and clearly defined. Men were culturally taught to expect a fairly predictable outcome for the effort they put in. This matters because men in the past weren't necessarily more noble, more patient, or more selfless than men today. They simply believed the exchange was reciprocal, and they believed the reward was likely to show up. Sacrifice feels rational when the outcome feels secure. That's the whole equation. Take away the sense of security, and you don't just remove the reward. You change the entire psychology of the sacrifice itself. And that's exactly what happened. The expectations placed on men didn't disappear. Provide, initiate, pay, compromise. Take responsibility when things go wrong. All of that is still culturally present in one form or another. What changed is the second half of the old arrangement, the certainty, the permanence, the social respect that used to come with playing the role well. Modern men are still being asked to walk toward the same responsibilities their fathers carried. But many of them no longer believe the payoff on the other side is guaranteed. Same responsibility, less certainty, more perceived risk. That's the shift. Not a shift in character, a shift in incentive. Once you see it that way, this stops looking like emotional withdrawal and starts looking like a rational recalibration. Let's make this less abstract. Picture an average guy in his early 30s, stable income, a bit of freedom, some savings, maybe a small business or a solid career track. Now picture him considering something serious, the kind of relationship that eventually leads to moving in together or marriage or kids. In his head, whether he says it out loud or not, a quiet calculation starts running. What am I giving up? Time, autonomy, money, flexibility, maybe even where I live. What am I actually getting in return? Companionship, partnership, a shared future, assuming it works. What happens if this goes well? A life built together, stability, meaning. What happens if it doesn't? Financial exposure, legal risk. Years of his life gone, with very little to show for it. This isn't him being cold. This is what any rational person does when the stakes get high enough. The bigger and more irreversible the sacrifice, the more scrutiny it deserves. You don't need a spreadsheet to run this calculation. You just need to have watched what happens when it goes wrong. Now here's where a lot of people push back, and honestly, they're not entirely wrong too. Love isn't supposed to work like a business contract. Nobody wants to be with someone who tracks every favor, every dollar, every emotional deposit like it's a ledger. That kind of scorekeeping kills intimacy, and it should. But there's a difference between obsessively counting small gestures and being clear-eyed about major, irreversible decisions. Relocating for someone, giving up a career opportunity, merging finances, taking on real responsibility for another person's life. These aren't small gestures, these are structural commitments with real consequences if things collapse. Calling something love does not make its consequences disappear. A man can be deeply in love and still understand that certain decisions carry weight he can't undo. Caring about outcomes isn't the opposite of love. Often, it's what responsible love actually looks like. Here's the part that breaks the lazy explanation completely. These same men who are cautious in relationships are often insanely committed everywhere else. They'll sacrifice sleep for their business. They'll sacrifice comfort for their health. They'll sacrifice social time for their kids if they already have them. They'll grind for years chasing a goal that might not even work out. So the idea that they simply lost the capacity to sacrifice doesn't hold up. What actually happened is more specific. They became selective about where that sacrifice goes. What if the willingness to sacrifice never disappeared at all? What if it just stopped being automatically pointed at one specific arrangement? That single shift changes everything about how you read this pattern. It's not that men stopped being capable of devotion. It's that devotion now has to be earned, proven, and justified before it gets handed over. Men don't only learn from their own experiences, they learn from watching other men. A friend goes through a brutal divorce and loses the house, the savings, years of stability. A coworker gets blindsided by a breakup he never saw coming after doing everything he thought he was supposed to do. A father quietly tells his son, "Don't make the mistakes I made." None of these stories need to represent the average outcome to have an effect. We remember vivid, painful examples far more strongly than boring, ordinary success stories. Nobody makes a documentary about the quiet, functional marriage that simply worked, but everyone remembers the guy who lost everything. One man experiences the consequence, 10 others absorb the lesson. That doesn't mean every relationship ends in disaster. It means the perceived risk goes up, even when the real numbers are more complicated than the stories suggest. And perceived risk is often what actually drives behavior, not the full picture. There's a deeper contradiction sitting underneath all of this. And it's uncomfortable to talk about, honestly. Modern culture celebrates independence for everyone. Both partners are expected to be self-sufficient, capable, autonomous. That's not a bad thing. But if both people are fully independent, the old logic of sacrifice starts to wobble. What does traditional sacrifice even mean when neither person structurally needs the other to survive? Which expectations are genuinely shared now? And which ones quietly stayed exactly where they were? This isn't an argument against independence, it's an observation about what happens when one part of the culture modernizes and another part doesn't catch up at the same pace. Modern equality in one category can sit right next to older, traditional expectations in another. And when those two systems collide inside a single relationship, confusion follows. Some men respond to that confusion with resentment, but a lot of them respond with something quieter, withdrawal. And withdrawal is not the same thing as rebellion. Most of these men aren't trying to punish anyone. They're not waging a war against women. They're not trying to prove a point. They're simply reaching a private conclusion and acting on it. That arrangement doesn't work for me anymore. That's the whole sentence. No manifesto, no coordinated movement, just a quiet decision made without any announcement at all. Opting out of one specific deal is not the same as attacking the entire idea of relationships. A man avoiding one kind of exposure isn't declaring war on love. He's refusing to walk back into a structure he's already watched fail people close to him. That distinction changes the whole conversation. Now here's where things get uncomfortable, because this is where the accountability gap shows up. We ask a lot of pointed questions about men who hesitate. Why won't he commit? Why won't he step up? Why won't he provide the way men used to? These questions get asked constantly, in articles, in conversations, in casual jokes about men being immature or afraid. But almost nobody asks the deeper question underneath all of it. What exactly is he being asked to step into? What does the modern version of that role actually guarantee him back? If a man is expected to carry old responsibilities without any of the old certainty, Hesitation isn't a character flaw, it's a rational response to an unclear contract. We love moralizing behavior, we love assigning blame to individuals. It's much harder to sit with the idea that people are simply responding to incentives, the same way they do in every other area of life. Let's ground this with 3 different men, because the reasoning isn't always the same, even when the outcome looks identical from outside. The first man watched his brother go through a financially devastating divorce. He didn't walk away from relationships entirely, but he became extremely careful about merging finances, moving too fast, or taking on legal exposure before trust is actually earned. The second man genuinely wants commitment. He's not avoiding love. What he refuses is a relationship where sacrifice only ever flows in one direction. The third man simply likes the life he's built. Freedom, autonomy, control over his own time. He's not wounded, he's not afraid. He just doesn't see a good enough reason to trade what he already has for something less certain. 3 completely different reasons. But from the outside, their behavior looks exactly the same. They stop volunteering for the traditional arrangement. That's the part most people miss when they try to explain this trend with one single story. It's also worth saying that both extremes get this wrong. Some people insist that any man who hesitates is immature or incapable of real love. That framing ignores the very real reasons behind a lot of that hesitation. But other men take this too far in the opposite direction. They let caution curdle into bitterness. They start treating every woman as a future threat instead of a potential partner. Risk awareness can slide into paranoia. Independence can slide into isolation. Self-protection can quietly become an excuse to avoid vulnerability altogether, which is its own kind of trap. Neither extreme is healthy. And neither extreme actually solves the underlying problem. Understanding why the caution exists doesn't mean every reaction to it is justified. So where does that leave things? The honest answer isn't to convince men their concerns are imaginary. It's also not to drag men back into an old role that doesn't function the way it used to. Sacrifice, if it's going to mean anything again, has to come from somewhere real. Trust that's actually been built, not assumed. Reciprocity that goes both directions, not just one. Demonstrated commitment, not promises. Shared values, actually tested over time, not just claimed early on. And ultimately, a voluntary choice, made freely, not extracted through guilt or pressure. If you're a man listening to this and recognizing yourself in it, here's the part worth sitting with. Don't sacrifice because someone tells you sacrifice is what proves your worth. Sacrifice when what you're building together actually justifies the cost of building it. That single distinction changes everything about how a relationship feels from the inside. So let's come back to where we started. Men didn't suddenly lose the capacity for loyalty, effort, or responsibility. They still show it every day in their careers, their goals, in the people they've already decided are worth the fight. What actually happened is narrower than the popular explanations suggest. A growing number of single men no longer see the traditional relationship bargain as something that automatically deserves their sacrifice. Before, sacrifice was tied to a fairly predictable role, with a fairly predictable reward waiting on the other side. Now the sacrifice is often still expected, while the outcome feels far less certain than it used to. You can debate who changed that deal. You can debate whether the fear driving all of this is fully justified or exaggerated by a handful of loud, painful stories. That conversation is fair. It's worth having. But there's one thing you can't argue your way around. You cannot demand voluntary sacrifice from someone who has quietly stopped believing the exchange makes any sense.